Let me welcome you to the second day of the Foreign Policy Initiative Conference. I'm Bill Kristol, a director of the Foreign Policy Initiative. We had a terrific day yesterday with Senator McCain and Boris Nemtsov from Russia, and very good panels on the Far East and the Middle East. And today, of course, we have Senator Lieberman, and later in the morning, former Spanish Prime Minister Aznar, and a panel in between, and then Deputy Secretary of State Jim Steinberg speaking just before lunch. So thank you all for coming, making it through the weather to be here. We're a little bit pressed for time, so I'm just going to dispense with the usual elaborate, flattering introductions of Senator Lieberman. He's very upset, but he'll get over that. And you all know Joe Lieberman, served in the United States Senate since 1989, and a real leader on many issues, but I would say especially perhaps foreign policy, homeland security, and national defense. Senator Lieberman is just back from a trip to Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and I'll say a few words about that first, and then we'll have a conversation for the rest of the time. Senator Lieberman.
Thank you. Thanks, Bill.
Sorry.
I'll go behind. Thanks very much, Bill, and thanks to all of you who come out at this very early hour. There's a special place in heaven, I'm sure, reserved for all of you who have come at this hour. I think, Bill, the introduction was a very nice introduction. I'm always reminded when somebody says that a few years ago I was at a meeting where Henry Kissinger was the speaker, and the introducer said, if there's anybody in the world who doesn't need an introduction, it's Henry Kissinger, so I give you Dr. Henry Kissinger. And Henry got up and said, you know, I suppose it's true that I don't need an introduction, but to tell you the truth, I like a good introduction. That was short, but a good introduction. I thank Bill and all who have worked with him to put together the Foreign Policy Initiative. You know, I remember studying at college that one of the unique aspects of American society was its pluralism, the extent to which it was pluralism in the sense of organizations, different associational groups. And Bill Kristol himself has probably been responsible for more association creations than any other living American today. I have benefited from all of them, some of them quite directly, and I thank him and his associates for doing so. I apologize for shorter time, but apparently Senator Reid did not consult with FPI when he scheduled our organizing caucus for 9:30 this morning. I wanted to talk first and then leave some time for Q&A about our trip to Iraq and Afghanistan last week with Senator McCain and Senator Graham and Senator Gillibrand. What I'd like to do is to provide you first with a brief back from the battlefield report on our war effort in those two countries. But let me start first with an overview comment, which is that the United States has probably never been as engaged as we are today across the broader Middle East into South Asia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, that is. And yet, paradoxically, despite our unprecedented involvement in this region, I've been struck in recent months talking to leaders, people from throughout the region, by a heightened uneasiness about the future of American power there. Behind closed doors mostly, there's an unmistakable uncertainty about our resolve and staying power. In other words, really unprecedented engagement, and yet unease about whether we're going to stay. And I certainly feel that it's in our national security interest to do everything we can to end that uncertainty. The way we handle the next chapters of our engagement in Iraq and Afghanistan it can do exactly that, and of course will also be of critical importance in determining the future of the greater Middle East with direct consequences for our security here at home. I'm not here to talk about Iran, but the fact is that the way we deal with the rising threat that Iran represents, particularly its quest of nuclear weapons capability, a doubt that's rising particularly in the Arab world and Israel, the better off we will be, not just in terms of Iran, but in terms of our credibility and strength throughout the world and our security here at home. Okay, Iraq. This past week witnessed a tentative agreement for a new government in Baghdad, as you know, after more than 8 months of gridlock. It's encouraging that all the major political blocs have decided to participate in this new coalition. In particular, it's significant that the speakership of the Iraqi parliament, a powerful position, has gone to Osama Najafi, a leading member of the Iraqi bloc and one of the most popular and strong Sunni leaders in the country. At the same time, I think we've got to say that the new government is a work in progress. Over the next month, Iraqis will be working to finalize a new cabinet, a power-sharing arrangement, and government reform and power devolution, which have been agreed to as part of the formation of the government, but of course not yet acted on or implemented. So the next month or two really provides a critical window of opportunity for the Iraqis and for us to assure with them that the new government reflects the will of the Iraqi people as expressed in the March election. And to me, that was for broad inclusiveness and for what I would call nationalism, that is Iraqi nationalism as contrasted with allowing any undue influence by neighbors, particularly Iran. I think it also has to include a meaningful role for former Prime Minister Alawi, whose bloc, after all, won the greatest number of seats in the election. Achieving these objectives is going to require a high level of continued engagement and support from the U.S. government. And here, looking back, I'm afraid that there was a period of time after the election when the U.S. was not as involved in the political interaction in Iraq, while other neighbors, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, some are friends, some are enemies, some were in between, were deeply involved. And I think we did lose an opportunity there. I think we're back in the game, and it's an important game because it is what will essentially redeem the enormous commitment in life and national treasure that we made to Iraq, well beyond, of course, anything that any of the other neighbors did. The administration, I think, has got to do a better job. I'm confident that they understand that now in the months ahead of making clear that it views the formation of the new Iraqi government as the start of a deepening partnership with the U.S. rather than paving the way for our disengagement and departure. Our troop numbers, thankfully, are going down. Our State Department personnel numbers must go up significantly. And most of all, our bilateral relationship has to be sustained and strengthened. One of the most important questions that will confront the new Iraqi government is the future of the U.S. military presence in the country after the end of 2011, when the current status of forces agreement runs out. This, of course, is first a matter for the Iraqis themselves. However, I will say that there are missions the U.S. military is currently carrying out that are clearly of critical importance for the security and stability of Iraq, and that our civilian agencies today are either poorly equipped or staffed and incapable of performing. The U.S. military presence across the disputed Arab Kurdish areas in northern Iraq particularly have been essential. Our military presence has been essential in keeping the peace in that area. For this reason, I suspect that the Maliki government will decide that it is in Iraq's national interest for at least to have for at least some limited U.S. military presence after 2011, and if the new Iraqi government makes this request, we should be ready to say yes. We shouldn't, in a sense, impose an unfair standard on Iraq for continued American presence simply because we have been so committed to it in the recent past. When we look around the region, we have military presence and military relationship in a lot of the countries in the Middle East, both Arab and, of course, Israel. Afghanistan. I will say that the last time Senator McCain and Senator Graham and I were in Afghanistan, I presume this reflects John's report to you yesterday as well, was July, and I was very impressed by the progress on the ground that our remarkable men and women in uniform under the command of a great American general, Dave Petraeus, have made. We really have begun to turn the tide, and that means quite specifically pushing the Taliban out in this absolutely necessary war. To be clear, of course, there's still some tough fighting ahead, and it's likely going to take longer, as Dave Petraeus cautions, and it did in Iraq, to achieve the irreversible progress in Afghanistan that I believe we have achieved in Iraq now. But the American people should be reassured that progress is happening. In central Helmand province, an area that was overrun by the Taliban 2 years ago, we walked without body armor through a bustling bazaar, visited a school packed with children. In the Zari district in the Kandahar province, the place where the Taliban actually first emerged in the 1990s, the insurgency is in retreat. These gains would not have been possible without the surge of forces ordered by President Obama last December. They also reflect the fact that there has been a surge, I think, in the strategic coherence of our war effort in Afghanistan. Let's remember that 2 years ago there was no nationwide campaign to break, no campaign plan to break the Taliban's momentum. In southern Afghanistan, different NATO countries were responsible for different provinces, and they were pursuing different strategies with little coordination among them. Hell of a way to fight a war. We had a fragmented military command structure under NATO, an even more balkanized civilian effort, and no unified leadership between the two. 2 years ago, the effort to build the Afghan National Security Forces, Army and police, was similarly lacking in organization, resources, and leadership. And there was no coherent plan for the reintegration of the insurgents who wanted to give up the fight. No serious effort to develop community-based police from the ground up, and no comprehensive effort to improve Afghan governance and combat corruption. Over the past 2 years, all of this has changed, and it's changed with acceleration over the last half year since Dave Petraeus has been there. Simply put, America's gotten its act together in Afghanistan, and so I'm pleased to say increasingly have the Afghan National Security Forces. As I say, there's still big challenges we need to overcome to achieve sustainable success in Afghanistan. For instance, and I presume John talked about this, the sanctuaries that our enemies have in Pakistan remain a significant problem. Likewise, while our forces are clearing and holding territory from the enemy, and the Afghan National Security Forces are really improving, the transition to Afghan control will need to be conditions-based and bottom-up, and therefore gradual. In that regard, it seems to me that it's increasingly clear, though I understand why the President did it, that his decision to announce that there would be the beginning of some withdrawal of our forces in July 2011 was a mistake, because it has led to misunderstandings and exploitation of that policy by our enemies, though from the beginning, obviously, the President said it would be based on conditions on the ground. It's essentially exacerbated the central strategic problem that we face in both Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is that the people at all levels in both countries are continuing to hedge their bets, making it harder for us to prevail. It means Afghan villagers are more reluctant to risk their lives and the lives of their family to stand with the coalition against the Taliban, although they despise the Taliban, because they've lived under it. It means Afghan officials are reluctant to crack down on the malign patronage and corruption networks, because they consider them to be critical to their continued hold on power if the U.S. Withdraws. And it means that elements of the Pakistani intelligence forces continue to have linkages with terrorist groups in the expectation, presumably, that they'll need them the day after we abandon the region, as we did once before. We've got to make it clear that that is not going to happen. this time. To the administration's credit, the president and others have begun to downplay the July 2011 date, emphasize instead the need to be more realistic in terms of transition to Afghan in the lead responsibility by 2014, which is the date that President Karzai has cited. And as you know, in the last month, on more than one occasion, the president has said that we will stay in Afghanistan until the job is done. That was pretty much his phrase. So I come back from this trip increasingly certain that that very few U.S. troops are going to be able to withdraw from Afghanistan next year, and I think we've got to be honest about that. Still more is needed to reassure the region, however, of our long-term commitment and to break the destabilizing hedging going on. In this regard, I want to say finally that the U.S. Has an opportunity, because we're now in preliminary talks with the Afghans about a new strategic partnership agreement between the U.S. and Afghanistan. As part of this discussion, I hope we will put on the table the idea of a binding long-term security pact with Afghanistan that would guarantee the Afghans' sovereignty and independence and extend beyond victory in the current war against the Taliban and the withdrawal of most American troops there that are now there in the future. This is obviously not the kind of arrangement that the U.S. would enter into or should enter into lightly. On the contrary, finalizing such a binding agreement would be contingent on first achieving progress across a range of areas in Afghanistan, including governance and security. On the table should be a discussion, however, of the location, in my opinion, of, for instance, an American air base, which I think would be good for stability in the region and probably one of the most tangible guarantors to the Afghans that we're not going to leave them behind. As with the process of NATO accession, perhaps different in many ways, but in this way, a good example, establishing a roadmap soon that would culminate eventually in a binding bilateral security agreement, I think would provide the Afghans with a positive strategic end state and the path to achieve it. And I think it would radically change the current regional psychological dynamic, which is not working in our favor. So my bottom line for both Iraq and Afghanistan is that the U.S. and the people of both countries are today making genuine headway, although it sometimes seems, and it actually is, kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step backward process. But the net is forward. The actions we take in the coming months will determine if our nation reaps the strategic dividends of the blood and treasure that we have invested in both of these countries. And as always, the best way to assure that we reap those dividends is for us here in Washington to work together across party lines in the interest of our national security. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for that very interesting and somewhat heartening report from the theater. You ended by mentioning Washington, so let me ask you about that. Whatever the mistake of announcing the July 2011 date, I suppose that the effects of that have already been felt, and I suspect we're now recovering from that, since it looks like we're not going anywhere in July 2011, and the same with Iraq, perhaps, the excessive disengagement from Iraq. How confident are you going forward? You speak with the President, the Vice President, Secretaries Clinton and Gates, Tom Donilon, that the administration is where you want it to be in terms of being serious about not squandering the gains in Iraq and also about carrying through in Afghanistan?
I'm quite confident about Iraq, and I'm reasonably confident about Afghanistan, but this is an ongoing dialogue. And if I have a fear about Afghanistan, Bill, it is that there will emerge an unusual alliance, particularly in the House, of anti-war Democrats, and I hate to use the word isolationist, but either isolationist or fiscally hawkish Republicans who will start to turn down our involvement prematurely in Afghanistan. I think the administration at this point understands. The president committed himself with this surge to success in Afghanistan, and I think they understand that they're in it now, and they're in it to succeed, and that for those who say that to the administration this is politically precarious within the Democratic Party, just to speak as bluntly as I can, I think it would be more broadly precarious if a pressured withdrawal from Afghanistan actually brought essentially a defeat there. Now the bright side of this so far is that the Republicans in Congress have almost entirely stayed true to the position on Afghanistan they took when President Bush went in and stayed in. And therefore, this is a moment when we could have a very strengthening bipartisan coalition for continued involvement in Afghanistan and success, because everybody understands how important it is to our security, not just because, of course, that's from where we were attacked on 9/11, but when you, just to state the obvious geographic reality, geopolitical reality, Afghanistan sits on the globe right between Iran and Pakistan, which I probably would say are our 1 and 2 security concerns in the world, so we can't afford to let Afghanistan collapse.
Buck McKean spoke yesterday here, also the incoming chairman of House Armed Services, and gave a very strong statement of support for the president's surge in Afghanistan, and I talked privately with him, and I'm not revealing any confidences. I mean, he really feels very confident, for whatever it's worth, about the Republicans in the House. There are 85 new ones, not all of whom he's met, but I've got to say, personally, having been at a few Tea Parties, I mean, and talked to a fair number of these candidates, there's a theoretical sort of, people have decided that because they're tough on spending and because Rand Paul is sort of maybe one of the more famous ones, that they're going to be for getting out of Afghanistan. I've never actually encountered that, right. I've got to say, and their basic instinct is to support our troops and to win the wars we fight, and you know, they may have their doubts about aspects of the strategy, but I think the Republicans will hold, honestly, if the administration holds. You can get a vicious dynamic the other way, obviously. And
I agree with your reaction to that, and I mean, there may be some cognitive dissonance inside, but I think ultimately the Tea Party people that I've known or talked to, in addition to being fiscally conservative, they're also just instinctively patriotic and I'd say national security hawks. So I think we've got a moment of opportunity here, and it's very important to our security.
You mentioned Pakistan and Iran, so I can't let you leave without asking about those two minor problems on each side of Afghanistan. You were in Pakistan briefly, I think, on this trip.
Yes.
What is your sense there? I mean,
well, look, as somebody said to me, and this really summarizes the complexity of our relationship with Pakistan, there is reason to believe that some elements of the ISI, their intelligence service, may be in contact with some terrorist groups that are anti-American, anti-Afghan. But it's also true that their intelligence service gives us, this was an interesting statement, more counterterrorism assistance than any other intelligence service in the world. Now, of course, part of that is because they unfortunately have the location of so many terrorist bases and cells there. But that summarizes the complexity of the relationship. But you know, they have their own governance problems. It's just going to be a constant push and pull. Why are they important to us? Obviously, I believe they have the 5th largest nuclear arsenal in the world. They're located in an extremely strategic position, and just in the most direct, well, not only the strategic position, the location of the terrorist groups is so critical to our security here, but also we bring more than half of our logistical support to our troops in Afghanistan through Pakistan. So stability there is very important. And, you know, it's one of those ironies that every time they vote, the Islamist parties do worse and worse. So this is not a radical population. It's not a pro-American population either. and it needs strong leadership from the government, which it hasn't had. So we got to hang in there, but I think basically we're going to be all right in Pakistan.
And so you feel, and General Petraeus feels that whatever the headaches and problems and difficulties that are presented by the sanctuaries and by other aspects of elements of the Pakistani government, that it's manageable. I mean, this is not a showstopper in terms of success in Afghanistan.
Well, I'd say this, that I think overall the stability, I don't worry about the stability of the Pakistani government or that they'll become anti-American at the leadership level. We've got actually increasing levels of support, and we continue to give them more assistance. But I will say we had a very direct, almost tough, but a good friendly discussion with General Kiani, the head of their military, and General Pasha, the head of the ISI, about this, that ultimately, from a military point of view, no matter how well we do on the ground in Afghanistan, we can't ultimately succeed so long as the enemy has safe havens and sanctuaries over the border in Pakistan. And I think from a military point of view, Kiani, who's very impressive, understands that, and I think there are ongoing discussions as to how, I mean, obviously one alternative would be for the United States to go in there on the ground, but that is a deep offense to Pakistani sovereignty and not likely to happen. So the alternative is for one alternative is obviously for the Pakistanis to be more aggressive about some of those sanctuaries, Miram Shah and Kedashur, in some ways as they are in parts of Waziristan. And I think there's good, healthy, tough dialogue going on, military to military, on exactly that possibility.
And Iran, you said you didn't come here to speak about Iran,
Yeah.
but we're happy to have you. You've been such a leader in Congress, and the sanctions that you were instrumental in pushing for have now exist, I guess, and are being implemented to, well, how much are they being implemented? How does that play out over the next few months? Where do you see things going with respect to Iran?
Yeah, well, if you're looking for encouragement about bipartisanship in Congress, the sanctions legislation, which really is tough, is a great example. I mean, John Kyle started out with Evan Bayh and me on this, and obviously Senator McCain was involved too, and ultimately it passed 99 to nothing, and the 100th senator wasn't feeling well that day. So it was very, very strong. The administration has actually effectively used some of it, particularly through the Treasury Department, in convincing a lot of our allies around the world, some to their economic detriment, South Korea, Japan, others, to Europe, the EU, to stop doing certain kinds of business with Iran. I think the Iranians are surprised, they're feeling it. But we've got to press the administration to use other parts of this sanctions legislation. They haven't really come down as hard as they might on some of the financial institutions that are still directly or indirectly doing business with Iran, and basically use the power in the law that says to them, you've got to make a choice. If you're going to deal financially with the Iranian institutions, including IRGC, you're not going to have access to American financial institutions. And so I think we're hurting Iran economically. Do I think that will be enough to lead the Iranians to stop their nuclear weapons program? I'm very skeptical about that. I'm glad that it looks like the P5+1 are going to sit down with the Iranians once they decide where in early December. But I think it's very important that sitting down with the Iranians does not mean that we in any way lessen our enforcement of the sanctions legislation. Matter of fact, I would toughen it. I hope the administration will toughen it until there's real action by the Iranians, which is to say the cessation of their enrichment program. This is a dangerous time now because a weak compromise with them will really be disastrous, not just in terms of the Iran breaking out with a nuclear weapons capability, but the impact that will have on the credibility that the U.S. has among our allies in the region. Again, I stress Arab and Israel, of course, but beyond that, the whole world is watching this. So our credibility in Asia, the Asia-Pacific region, will diminish greatly if we seem to accept a weak compromise with Iran. And of course, in the end, I think we've got to let the Iranian regime know that we're going to do everything we possibly can through diplomatic and economic means to stop their nuclear weapons program, but we'll use other means, including military, if that's absolutely necessary.
What's the congressional role going forward, do you think, on Iran?
Truth is that we're talking about that. Whether we, for the time being, tried together to express to the administration our one urgent appeal that they use some of the parts of the sanctions law that they haven't used yet. Two, that when they go to sit down with Iran in December, that they be very tough, that there be no limitation of the sanctions until there's actual positive response from the Iranians. And three, that we express what I believe is actually there in Congress, and I think it's there in the American people, that nobody wants to use military force against Iran, but there is a broad bipartisan base of support if the commander-in-chief comes to a point where he thinks that's necessary.
And so Congress could
express that in some way, but I think that's not tomorrow, but it may be down the road, depending on. I mean, when you think about it, by January it will have been 6 months since the sanctions began to be applied to Iran, and it's fair to say that there's been no voluntary limitation of their nuclear weapons program. There's been some involuntary limitation as a result of some problems they've had with it. So we haven't seen any really positive action in response yet to what we've done.
You had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this morning. This final question, which your staff is frantically signaling that maybe Senator Reid, I made a request, someone from the FPI made a request to Senator Reid's office just a few minutes ago to push the Democratic conference back half an hour, but what can I say?
Bill, he said, Bill, who?
Exactly. They're not there, yeah. It's deeply wounding to my ego, but you had an op-ed in the Journal this morning, sort of suggesting they really, and I kind of agree with this, that despite all the talk about bitter partisanship, and that actually, for the past 2 years in foreign policy, there has been a fair amount of bipartisanship. I think some political scientists I know did a study. There have been fewer partisan votes in the previous Congress that's now ending on foreign and defense matters than in most Congresses.
Well, that's interesting.
No big fights on Afghanistan, Iraq, defense budget, nominations even. I mean, Secretary Clinton, Secretary Gates, you know, everyone's happy with that. I mean, it's sort of, and then going forward, I think you make the case in the Journal that you really could have 2 years of pretty healthy bipartisanship in foreign policy.
Yeah, I hope so, and I wanted to sort of state the case as a reality, which I think it is, just to give it attention. I've heard you talk about this, so you've inspired me in this regard. But also to say that we've got, as a result, a real opportunity. I mean, after the Cold War, there was a kind of reflexive, Republicans opposed Clinton on some things like Bosnia. Democrats, of course, opposed President Bush on some of the post-9/11 exercises of our power in the world. And, but interestingly, of course, I think that both Bush and Clinton operated within the broad mainstream of American foreign policy values and history. But to me, the story that in some ways neither party wants to acknowledge, unless there are courageous people like you and I, is that if you look back at the last 2 years, the story of the Obama foreign policy is as much continuity as change from the Bush administration policy. I don't mean it's all continuity, obviously, but it's as much. And I cite Afghanistan, the long-term, you know, a lot of Democrats felt that the day after Obama was inaugurated, we would start the withdrawal from Iraq. Obviously, he's made a long-term commitment. And then in other ways, like really the acceleration of the drone strikes on Al-Qaeda, really quite significantly. So I think if we can acknowledge that this exists, I'm not saying this is good, but for all the talk about the need for bipartisanship in domestic policy, I think in the end it may be harder to achieve than in foreign policy. And I cite in this article 3 areas: one, Afghanistan; second, Iran, both of which we've talked about; and the third we haven't is trade. There's a real possibility for a center-out administration, Republican coalition in Congress to pass free trade legislation, beginning hopefully with the Korea-U.S. agreement. And that will not only be important economically to us, because I think it opens markets for American businesses that can create jobs here, but it will be a very important statement at this moment to our friends in Asia who want us to show a commitment to reassure them about their standing in the face of an increasingly assertive China. China and Iran are different, very different, but in both parts of the world, their neighbors are worried about their potential for expansion, and in both parts of the world, their neighbors look to us more than any other country to maintain stability, and we should do it not just for them, but for our own interests, both in terms of economics and in terms of our security. I think I better go.
On that note, thank you really so much for joining us this morning, and thank you for everything you do.
I'll give
my best to Harry.
Yeah.
Give my best to Harry. Right. Good to see you.